Precious.
One of the most tragic scenes in Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings trilogy is the one that begins the final film. Smeagol finding the ring, or rather his best friend and cousin Deagle finding it, only for Smeagol to take it from him, forcefully. It's a dark scene that, sitting down to make notes for this, I found there's a lot more to say about than I originally imagined. And a small first point to begin this with would be to mention the choice of this scene to open the final film with, because in the book, this moment only comes in Gandalf telling the tale to Frodo in the Fellowship of the Ring. It's also a scene Peter Jackson originally intended to place in the second film, but I think giving Smeagol the opening to The Return of the King brings his character much more into focus and sets up a lot of important themes for the story ahead. You know, whilst it's definitely not true, you could argue or view this trilogy of films as a three-act tragedy about Gollum, a creature in the first film seen simply as a horrible monster and villain, to which Frodo remarks,
"It's a pity Bilbo didn't kill him when he had the chance."
In the second film, Gollum is given hope through Frodo, who learns to pity and care for him, who calls him Smeagol and treats him with humanity, and Smeagol responds to it. Seems to rediscover some belief in himself that he does have the capacity to do good, to value and stand up for himself beyond total dependence on the ring.
Leave now and never come back.
There is potential for someone treated by so many, including himself, as a monstrous creature to actually grow and find redemption, but just as in real life, it is a very difficult task. Trust is a mountainous task. The betrayal Smeagol feels when Frodo leads him into Faramir's arms kills off any growing belief Smeagol was developing. Redemption turns to tragedy as the second film ends with Gollum plotting revenge that then plays out in the final film. And after its failure, Gollum follows Frodo all the way to Mount Doom intending to steal but then inadvertently destroying the ring. His death, both tragic but also somewhat an act of redemption, as without him Frodo would likely have kept it. So in a sense you could technically frame the entire trilogy with Gollum as the protagonist, if you wanted to. At the least his arc deserves being brought into clear focus, and so beginning this film with Smeagol discovering the ring is the perfect choice. Plus, how his fight with Deagle here at the beginning parallels his fight at the ending with Frodo, both fights ending with the loser's death. But why don't I actually get into the scene now? Our opening shot is of a worm, where we zoom out to see Smeagol holding it with quite a complicated expression on his face. Firstly, what was shown of Smeagol from the previous two films is someone who enjoys eating animals still alive, even eating a worm during the marshes, and here enjoying watching it wriggle in his fingers like helpless prey. Smeagol looks happy here, but there's something malevolent to his eyes that makes me think of a child burning ants. Generally a great delight at finding something so powerless to exert total power and control over. And I think on a first viewing, assuming you recognise Andy Serkis' face here as being Smeagol, then you might expect Smeagol here to eat the worm or something until the hook comes into shot. He's fishing. This isn't yet the Gollum we come to know that catches fish with his hands and eats them live, but a more human or hobbit approach to catching fish. Smeagol very slowly, with a still fixed and faintly malevolent gleam to his face, pierces the worm with the hook, almost laughing at the point it pierces. They're fishing in the Shire, visually similar to where Frodo sat reading some 500 years later. For obvious reasons, this scene re-evokes the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring in the Shire, where beyond a prologue to set out the idea of the ring itself, we're taken away to a dreamily tranquil and innocent world. There we saw Bilbo troubled by, but certainly not poisoned by the power of the ring, and saved a potential future poisoning by the kindness and wisdom of Gandalf, but things really only turn dark in the wonderful world of the Shire there with the arrival of the Ringwraiths, this outer external force of darkness brought there by the ring, but despite some snappiness from Bilbo in places, no real sense of darkness to the hobbits or the Shire life itself. The contrast there to what we see now is a big part of what makes this scene hit, because now, obviously affected by the ring, it's the hobbits themselves that bring darkness out into the Shire. Which is where the music stops, and then what should be funny becomes faintly worrying when Deagle does not resurface. Silence then gives way to the sad violin, I suppose a leitmotif of the ring's tragic effects. Deagle takes it and resurfaces, perhaps deliberately away from Smeagol so we can look at the ring undisturbed. It's half obscured in mud. In fact, we haven't seen a clear shot of the ring at all yet, which I like. I feel like the obvious thing to do would be to have it appear gleaming and with an obvious treasure allure to it. That would be the cliche, but here it's muddied. Just picking it up muddies Deagle's hands, hinting at its corrupting effect more than its allure. And then Deagle doesn't try to clean it but strokes it with a finger as though it were some precious pet, and we get the mystic chant to echo both the ring's ancient power but also re-evoke the prologue.
Is that Deagle, my love?
Deagle only notices Smeagol when he represents a threat, which was shown in the way his hand closes before he turns to face him.
It's my birthday, and I want it.
You know, the terror of this scene is precisely because there is no apparent terror to anything. No darkness, no ring wraiths or orcs, no shots of Sauron, or even, whilst the ring is there, nothing to suggest it's at all magical. It feels simply like two friends just found any old ring in a river that doesn't even appear shiny because it's covered in mud. Out of something so simple and unassuming as this, such horror occurs. But when Deagle does not respond, Smeagol makes an impulsive, unrestrained lunge for the ring, which brings some ominous noises into the music. Where he fails, he smiles jokingly as though to kind of play it off that they were playing about, but Deagle does not take it as a joke. He looks stern and mistrustful. And interestingly, no words or explanations are given. No attempts to communicate or persuade the other or anything. In fact, neither character speaks from here on, which adds to how hauntingly irrational this is. More so, both characters are positioned incredibly closely to each other and rotate before the camera, which gives it a faintly dizzying effect. You know, there's not clear distance between them with clear close-ups on their faces or space to throw punches or anything, because that would give us clarity and kind of rationality to what is a fundamentally unclear and impulsive, almost intoxicated moment. You know, both characters intoxicated by the ring in just the way the camera work here feels intoxicating for us. The ominous noises in the music become a kind of wailing, and a deep drowning thud comes in like a heavy heartbeat speeding up. We get a very quick shot of the turning, dizzying sky as Deagle falls to the ground, which is where he loses. Suddenly we don't hear much of the snarling or screaming. It becomes muffled behind the music to emphasise Deagle's life being extinguished, but also to emphasise how Smeagol can't hear him anymore. Can't hear or focus on anything other than this dark music of the ring. The thud slows and stops as Deagle eventually dies. Smeagol pulls open his now much cleaner hand in his dead and purer form, no longer stained by the ring, and the ring itself is now also clean and shining with allure. We finish with a shot of Smeagol triumphantly holding it in a way that will echo a similar shot in Mount Doom. Out of a seemingly beautiful and peaceful world of best friends, total madness and horror occurs. Gollum, in part, is of course meant to represent what Bilbo or Frodo could have easily turned into, and we know that, but I also don't think the reality of it hits home often enough. We can kind of half believe Smeagol is somehow lesser, weaker, more easily corruptible, whereas Bilbo and Frodo are better people. Which perhaps is true. I've already pointed out a certain faint malevolence to Smeagol prior to the ring. But what I think about watching this scene is how lucky Bilbo and Frodo both were, in a way. Because when they obtained the ring, they didn't have to fight for it. Bilbo found it away from Gollum, had enough space to at first run, then could hide with its invisibility. He didn't need to fight to the death the way Smeagol did if he wanted the ring, because Deagle, as depicted here, was equally just as intent on killing him. All Bilbo had to do was hide, follow Gollum's trail out of the cave, and then jump over him. And even then he came close to killing Gollum despite the fact he posed no obvious threat by that point. Were he not invisible? Had Gollum seen him and started wrestling with him or something? Perhaps Bilbo too would have been driven to murder. Even then though, he would have just seen Gollum as some monstrous crazed creature and he wouldn't have had to feel guilt about it in the way he would have had he fought with his best friend. Bilbo was able to keep the ring mostly secret so that he did feel no obvious threat of people trying to steal it. Until this scene with Gandalf, Bilbo looks in this moment like he could have been drawn into a fight here, had Gandalf's magic and sense of how to handle the moment not shaken Bilbo out of his paranoia. It's just to say, in very different circumstances, Bilbo could have done exactly the same. Maybe Frodo. What if the dangers of the ring hadn't been explained to Frodo and Sam the way they never were to Smeagol and Deagle? I don't think you can necessarily say they'd have been as bad in Smeagol's position, but it is an interesting question. And whilst the ring is the main force of corruption, I think the act of impulsively, irrationally murdering his best friend is also a big part of what corrupts Smeagol so much worse than them. I mean, obviously he also has the ring for 500 years, but worse in these early moments, I mean.
Cursed us. Murder they call us.
Nobody ever explicitly finds out that Smeagol murdered Deagle, but he's still strongly suspected, and the effect of the ring also makes him quite estranged from his family and community.
They cursed us and drove us away, and we wept, precious. We wept to be so alone.
The effect of the ring is one where the bearer does become paranoid of others wishing to take it, sure, but here it's the idea of Gollum being driven away, shunned for the strange behaviour the ring brings out in him. How true or not it is to say he was actually cursed and driven away, I don't know. I suspect someone more versed in Tolkien's lore might be able to comment, but I doubt it's at all surprising Gollum expects and interprets persecution from the Shire folk. He killed his best friend. After the impulsiveness of the fight wears off, he'll no doubt feel guilt for his actions and a sense of loss. He might even unconsciously wish persecution upon himself, even if he also fears and hates it, hoping it'll absolve him of his guilt. And so then I think it's not just the ring, it's the twofold effect of grappling with the guilt of committing murder, making it impossible to not recognise the darkness within himself, and then also the constant condemnation and shunning of the other Shire folk, making his actions impossible to forget. One sudden, impulsive, ring-driven moment leads to feeling like a very bad person. Suddenly everybody treats him like he is, and that makes it very hard to believe there's anything good in him at all, which lasts for 500 years before Frodo begins to help some of his goodness re-emerge. And as much as he might hope, somewhere deep down, that the condemnation of others will absolve him of his guilt, it doesn't. It makes the guilt even worse. Painful to the point it becomes completely unbearable, so he shuts it out. His guilt twists into a defensive retaliation where he starts to think of those who condemn him as the bad people. He projects outwards and shuns goodness as something horrid, seen best in how he curses the sun. Now, rather than trying to overcome or feeling guilt for his darkness, he embraces it. He embraces the ring not just as something precious and powerful, but as an actual friend, an identity. This side of him that doesn't have to suffer in guilt. The ring gains power over him because it feels like an escape in that sense, when in reality it's a trap. And also how very alone all this shunning makes him. There are so many moments in the story where Frodo needed Gandalf's wisdom or Sam's support. He had that healthy environment around him that made bearing the ring a lot more possible. Any support Smeagol might have had was gone as a result of murdering Deagle though. And so when all you're left with is isolation and self-condemnation, the ring does literally become his only friend. Of course he listens to what its message is. Sauron's own malice and spite again spares him suffering the feeling of guilt or loneliness, and so it takes over. He forgets the name Smeagol altogether, becomes Gollum. This shot of his eyes changing summarises it perfectly. They look worn and pained at first, then they close and open with Gollum's eyes, eyes of malice and bitterness. It's not just the power of the ring, it's also the effects of murder and of being shunned, that isolation that twists Smeagol into Gollum. Another important thing about beginning the Return of the King with this scene is what it reflects for Frodo and Sam. Two very close hobbits who, in this film, are driven apart to the point Frodo says,
"Go home."
I think beginning this film with two other very close hobbits driven apart to the point of violence makes this later conflict between Frodo and Sam more effective, as well as making Sam's courage, determination and care to come back in spite of what Frodo said so much more powerful. Sam is a heartbreakingly good person, even if he does never show empathy for Smeagol, and I think that's kind of what's clever about the dynamic between the three of them. Frodo's empathy for Smeagol does offer him the potential to grow and rediscover some of his goodness, but it also makes Frodo vulnerable to being exploited or tricked in a way that Sam isn't. And whilst that certainly doesn't mean Frodo shouldn't have empathised with Gollum, I don't think that whatsoever. I just think it goes to show there's a risk, one you have to be aware of if you want to avoid falling for it. I was going to also analyse the montage of Smeagol becoming Gollum here, but I think doing that would be repeating a lot of what I've said already. I mean, I love the shot of the eyes changing, I love the transition between the two scenes. You know, Smeagol puts on the ring, then we see him literally thrown into rocks by it. And I think this whole montage is suitably disorientating to emphasise not just how nightmarish this is for Smeagol himself, but also how disorientated and clouded and unable he is to think rationally about anything right now. It's genuinely chilling to watch and highlights just how much loneliness is a factor in what happens to Smeagol. I similarly love how Gollum's voice narrates over this montage as though it is the voice of the ring convincing him, pulling him in like the manipulative voice of an abusive partner. It's all incredibly sad when you start relating the character of Gollum to real life. Whilst it's not entirely the same, and Tolkien himself was never one for direct allegories, I think part of Gollum as a character, particularly in the films, is to do with substance abuse, and also arguably an abusive relationship with how the two different sides of Gollum become clearly personified. It is sad. It's a wonderful scene though, that is a good example of backstory done right. It's not just there to teach us about the character, but to make a genuine thematic point about the struggle against condemnation, the effects of isolation, and also to set up the later conflict between Frodo and Sam, the later fight between Frodo and Gollum, and to set up space for his finale as a character at Mount Doom. This scene does all of that beautifully, and no, it's not my absolute favourite scene in the trilogy. That would probably be one of the many moving moments between Frodo and Sam. This scene though still is a strong contender. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I intend to make more bigger, more in-depth videos on the Lord of the Rings someday. If you enjoyed it, if you want more analysis on these films, please like the video, comment your thoughts too, what I missed. There's a lot about Tolkien's lore I don't know that would probably be relevant, so that as well. Subscribe if you fancy it, or even more, support me on Patreon, but otherwise, hopefully see you next time. And a special thank you goes to Devin, Kestrel, Arwen, Stephen Legg, Janice McMahon, Shichu Kaber, Samara Salsi, Sharikov214, Joshua C. Follier, Chad Bramwell, Incomplete Sentience, Emily Tarras and Nicholas Patrick. Thank you.